They're such a part of American history. And the fact that James Dinsmore grew up in New Hampshire, went to Louisiana, first went to Natchez, Mississippi, then Louisiana, then came up to Kentucky. He lived in every major part of the United States in those early years. And then you see Julia transition from a slave society to what it was like after the Civil War, lived through a time period when, when she was born, they were still using steamboats. She dies, and she gets to see an airplane flying overhead before she dies. So huge changes went on during Julia's time period. And it's interesting. So while they were actually individually almost a part of American history, you had the relationship with Teddy Roosevelt, the relationship with George Washington, Silas Dinsmore, the Indian agent. It's also just a family that really went through the same transitions that American families went through. And I think one of the things that people realize when they come out to the Dinsmore Homestead is that these were real people going through real things. And I think that's one of the more interesting things about this, because people realize that history isn't just what you read in the books, that it's what people actually experienced, and that their ancestors would have experienced something somewhat similar, if not exactly the same as what the Dinsmore family did.
The homestead is directly connected to 7 U.S. presidents, including George Washington.
And we also found some, the big heavy red velvet drapes that probably were the original in the parlor. And then, of course, we have some of the drapes that came from the Macomb house in New York that George and Martha lived in when they served as president, which, again, is part of the history of the family. Everybody brought stuff here and left it, and we're very grateful for that, because it's a thread that runs through the history of the United States and ties this family in with everybody. So this house belongs to everybody. It has caused me to read everything I can get my hands on about that period of history, which is, of course, the history of the United States. And so I have learned so much about the Roosevelt family, about the people that she lived with and associated with in New York. I think about Julia. She saw the invention of so many things that we just take for granted today. Like the building of the Roebling Bridge. Airplanes, first used. Automobiles, first used. And electricity, something she grew up without. Telephones, phonographs, just so many things that happened in her lifetime. And because she was so faithful to record things, we benefit from that today.
Martha Breasted, who turned the homestead into a museum, is always well remembered.
Martha was a zany person. That's how I thought of her. She was full of fun. She was eccentric in the sense that she thought things up that nobody else would think up. She was funny. She loved this place more than I think anyone else in her family that we know of, and loved to come here. She loved Dinsmore. I think she loved it so much because she spent time here as a child. I think she was 10 when she first came here to visit Miss Julia, her aunt. And she said that her first visits here were so wonderful because everything was so green and beautiful here. She loved Kentucky, and especially she loved coming down that hill, coming to Dinsmore. It was one of the good things in her life. And she called Mr. Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, she called him Uncle Frank. A very good friend of the Roosevelts. In fact, she and Charles Breasted, before they were married, were at the White House in the Rose Garden, passing through the Rose Garden, and some reporter asked the president, who is that couple? And he said, oh, that's Martha Ferguson and Charles Breasted. They're going to be married soon. So she said that our president at that time announced her wedding. And she just laughed and thought that was the most funny thing. And one thing she did tell us, and I never forgot it, She said, now when you show the house and when you have the tours, always remember this is not just a Boone County home. This is a place for all people from all places because the history touches the world. And it does. This house and the history of this house is all over the world in the sense of the people in it who lived here, who belong here, and have ties here. They have scattered all over to the Philippines, to Europe, this country, but this was one of her favorite places. She loved it. She traveled extensively. Her father was Robert Ferguson and a Scotsman, and he was a Rough Rider with Teddy Roosevelt, along with John Greenway. So the three of them were close friends. And then, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was another friend. So, and George Washington was a friend of James's father-in-law. The other end of the family, and George Bush was in the same school with John Greenway. And so we say, when I would do tours, I'd say we go from George to George, because the family was tied into very many famous people.
The reason we know so much about life on the Dinsmore homestead is because of the many letters between family members and the daily journal that Julia kept for 93 years. Volunteers transcribe these writings and become fascinated themselves with the readings.
It's very difficult to see on occasion because Julia's handwriting, once you get used to it, it's fairly easy to understand, but it fades sometimes and it's very difficult to do. She's reporting and recording numbers. She's accounting things she records in her journal, as well as what was done every day and why it was done. I think that the intent was that it be a record that could be looked back at after she was gone to determine, you know, how the property was used, how she used the property. The names are familiar names to Burlington now. And, you know, we have Clores, we have Connors, we have various different names that you see on the signs in Burlington. And so it's that part's very interesting. Most people, when I tell them what I'm doing, they think it's a fascinating job, and, you know, why couldn't I find something like that sort of thing? So I feel very privileged to be doing this. Most of the people that I have spoken with about what I do here have come out to see it. So, so I think that's important. I can't describe it probably as well as what they would learn if they actually came here, and they do. So I'm happy that they will. I guess I wanted to know how this woman could possibly have taken over the tasks that were presented to her following the death of her sister and her taking on raising the two girls, and then the death of her father, which meant that if she was to stay here, she would have to make a go of it somehow and then learn the way she did that. So she had to stand up for herself and make sure she got fair market price for her things compared to what her peers were getting, who were all men. So yes, she was an amazing woman of the time. And what I found is that seasonally, she was very knowledgeable in terms of farming policies and procedures, and she would grow different crops different years in order to manage the soil properly. She just had so many things on the go. I don't know how she managed it. I think she was probably better at what she did than most of the men in the area at the same time. She always felt that the men were trying to be lazy and not accomplish the things that she had set out for them to do. She quite often would ride around the property to make sure they were doing what she had set out for them to do. She was an elitist, I suppose, because she was educated far more than most of the people that she worked with. And I guess you see that with her dealings with the men that she she viewed as inferior to her. Although, of course, they wouldn't agree at all. One thing that I find very interesting, and I did mention it to you, Kathy, and well, you were aware of it anyway, was she was not a big churchgoer. Although the church, was a very communal sort of place at that time, and people went out of their way to go to church. She would go for weddings and funerals and baptisms, and really enjoyed that. But apart from that, I don't think she felt that it was necessary. I don't know whether she felt that the preachers weren't any good, or I just felt that she didn't think she needed to. So many negative things that happened in her life turned her off of organized religion, and she just felt that she refers to God.
She's very religious.
Yeah, she refers to God in her journals, but not. She wasn't a churchgoer. She would go. I think maybe she had company and they went. She might accompany them, but as a rule, no. And she made sure that her nieces went to Sunday school, so it wasn't that she, didn't approve of it or anything. She made sure they got a good basis for their values. Sometimes we don't understand the grit that those women had, and what they had to put up with. We have life so easy, at least we think we do. I see them as women who were able to manage with very little, and I don't know that if we were put in that situation, if we would be able to. She was in constant communication with many relatives. She would go to the post office at least once every day, including Sunday, and occasionally twice a day. And every time she would have letters to send, and she would be receiving other letters from people. It was the 19th century email, I guess, and she was on top of everything. She got magazines and newspapers. She knew what was going on in the world, and so she not only knew her own area, but she also knew what was going on in the world. And she went visiting quite often, too. She had relatives in New Orleans that she liked to go and see occasionally. And her niece, my big baby, as she used to refer to her, who had married and gone with her husband out to the Dakotas, she made trips there regularly as well, and terrible, terrible climate, and just took the train all the way, and this awful weather, and put up with it because her family was there. Family was everything to Julia, everything. But she would go to see the opera, for instance, in whatever was being performed there, and the same thing up in St. Paul when she would go and visit Buddy, who was her brother-in-law, and the girl's father, who had remarried and was a lawyer up in St. Paul. And she would go there, and she would be part of the social scene, and she would take in everything that the family would ordinarily do up there. I think one of the thrills of her lifetime was going to the Chicago World Fair. And she was absolutely astounded by all of the things that were on display there. She was just fascinated by the whole thing. And she did get to do things like that. She liked, and she also liked to have some of the newer things here, didn't she? She would take advantage of which, although she was very frugal, having said that, she was a very frugal person. She also took care of her former slaves who had moved across the river to Rising Sun, and I'm not sure whether, I guess they were in a retirement situation, although they paid rent. Julia paid for them. She would purchase shoes and dresses and coats and things like that for them. She was very good, and would make sure the doctor would see them if they needed medical care and that sort of thing too. She took care of those people that came up from New Orleans, or from Louisiana. It seems to me that this place had a lot of life in it when she was here. you know, it was just her and her girls, but there were always people visiting, always. And they wouldn't come just for a dinner. They would come and stay for days at a time. They would come some distance, but they would also come from Burlington, and they'd stay over for a couple of days. And
she was real short, this is one thing. And that was back when they used to have huckster wagons. You know, the grocery stores had huckster wagons. And Mr. Gully from out at Burlington would come around once a week and deliver groceries. And Mother said that Miss Julia was so short, and she had a little stool, and the old phone was on the wall, and you'd ring them like that. And she said that every week she'd say, "Mr. Gully, I would like to give you my order." She still had that accent, I guess. She asked me to describe Miss Isabella, and I said, well, she reminds me of an Alka-Seltzer that you drink, put in a glass of water, because I said she just fizzled all the time. She was always busy, and she talked with her hands, and her hair, when she went out, she was always dressed so pretty. But here on the farm, she wore an old hat, and her hair just flew whichever direction, and she was just a super nice person. And she really had plans for making this home again, I think. There's a lot of stories about Martha. I'll tell you the one I told you when I brought my mother in to see Martha after Mother hadn't seen her for a good many years. And Mother had Alzheimer's. And I said, Martha's home, would you like to stop and see her? And she said, yeah, I'd like that. So we came in the back kitchen door. And when we walked in the kitchen, Martha looked up and she said, why, sis, you're looking older than your mother. She was a great person. She really was. She was real friendly. She liked people. And she liked to party. She was a party gal. But she was a very thoughtful person and she was a caring person. And when she was here, she made friends. I mean, she didn't just stay here and have her old friends coming in. She had new friends, and she was a nice person. One of the things that I have picked up on when people come is the importance of an education. Because when they come in, they say, my goodness, look at all the books. And I said, yes, and they were read too, because Miss Julia was very much into education and reading and writing. I mean, she wrote for, I don't know what magazine it was that she wrote for, but she also had her book of poetry. And I have my book someplace. It's the original little green book, you know, in the first printing of it, I guess, that Mother had. And that's the one Mother used to read to me out of. The fact that it's still the family. It's not a museum like a cold place that you go to that's just facts and that's it. Because when we go through and tell them things, we tell them the funny things, the interesting things that they've done. And I think they get to know that this was a family, not just some important people that went to Washington and forgot about home. I don't think they ever forgot about home. I just wish everybody could see the human side of this place. That's what I try to do when I'm here. It's because it's just not an old house that sits here. It's got history. It's got real people. Nice people too. And the people that worked here were nice people too. Oh, I hope it keeps on going. I know it takes a lot of money and it's a lot of work involved. And we need people to help. And the only thing you have to do to help is come out here and donate your time and learn some history. And everybody, no matter how old or how young, and I'm sincere about this, can help. So I hope we'll get more help. Not just money. I mean, there's more things, not more things important, but just as important as the money. We need people to be enthused and just pass the message on. And I love the history of it, and that's very important, because just one generation is all it takes to lose it. One generation not telling the kids and it's gone.